2023, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker Pro Tem, and thank you for all your words. Ms. Wasserman Schultz and my friend, the good doctor. Being from Scottsdale, my community has actually family that have been devastated by what's going on in Israel. So, Madam Speaker Pro Tem, have you ever had one of these moments where you're walking out here and one of the reporters shoves their little recorder in your face, and it's not till sort of the next day that you start to realize with what you wish you would have said? So last week, a young man sticks his microphone in my face and goes, "Aren't you tired of going to the floor every week and saying the exact same thing?" If that's true, I apologize to the poor team here who has to try to write down our words to listen to this. I don't think I'm saying the exact same thing. It's the same theme because it's true. The problem is every week it's getting worse. And we just do nothing. So we're going to walk through some of the numbers of what's happened in the last couple weeks, and maybe someone will actually hear the words instead of thinking I'm giving the same speech that I was giving a year ago, because the numbers are dramatically uglier. And if I don't talk too long, I'm going to try to actually at the end here walk through some things that are positive, but it's just going to require this body to actually do something. So just to sort of point out that I'm no longer alone, I'm now starting to finally see in some of the mainstream press, not just the financial press, not just the bond press, but actual coverage of, and look, here's Robert Rubin, the former Treasury Secretary under a Democrat president. The U.S. is in a terrible place fiscally. It's a Democrat. Here's the head of J.P. Morgan, Jamie Dimon, driving towards a fiscal cliff. Okay? Now, when Taleb, now for those of you who are fans of Black Swan, Anti-Fragile, actually, I loved both books. I'm a little bit more of a George Gilder fan when it comes to economics. For anyone that knows who that is, you're a real geek. But he's basically saying, and my understanding is he's quite liberal. He's an economist who basically predicted the Black Swan, and then it happened. He talks about fragility, which is something I've come here and talked about over and over, that with the scale of debt, the fragility we've created, he basically saying death spiral. Anyone care? Are these just people you want to ignore because they're not giving you free rein to just keep borrowing and spending? So we're going to walk through some boards, because that's sort of what we do here, because I found when you're talking things with 12 zeros on it, no one can picture them. So first off, to demonstrate how much uglier the numbers are today than they were even way back when, like last December. Does anyone remember the Wayback Machine a month ago? Understand, CBO updated their numbers. The update was $1 trillion additional borrowing on what was projected. And our joint economic economists, we're working on some math right now, and I'll show it over and over in the board. If we don't see some substantial turnaround in tax receipts or the bending of healthcare spending, we may borrow $3 trillion this year. And I'm trying to find ways to get people to pay attention. So if I tell you at the current borrowing rate, every 140 days, we click off another $1 trillion of borrowing. $1 trillion every 140 days. Is anyone hearing this? So, back to our Wayback Machine. This is a board I produced for a floor speech last month. So I think I did this in December. Anyone that's really smart, that's able to read really small type, can you catch the mistake? We were basically saying, hey, we're going to head towards a deficit that, the deficit, all discretionary, military included, is $1.7 trillion. And then you add up everything else with it, and we're going to have to borrow this wedge. Well, if I tell you right now that our prediction is somewhere around $2.6 trillion to $3 trillion of borrowing, if our budget that we get to vote on, remember, all this over here, as a member of Congress, you don't vote on. It's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's Indian Health Service. It's the things that are on, actually Indian Health Services is actually an appropriated item. It's the things that are on formula. So it's the vast majority of our spending are on autopilot. Process this. Every dime a member of Congress votes on is borrowed. Plus, congratulations, it looks like every dime we vote on is borrowed, plus another $1 trillion. So let's just assign it to something. $1 trillion of Medicare is going to be borrowed, and then we don't vote on it. So next time you have someone say, well, just balance the budget, we're going to balance it right away. You can wipe out every dime in the military. You can wipe out every dime of what you think is this government. So there's no State Department, there's no Supreme Court, there's no Congress. Maybe we'd be better off. But there's nothing. It's all gone. You still got to borrow another $1 trillion just to cover the mandatory, what we call the earned entitlements. The wheels will come off. And we'll do everything we can to avoid telling you the truth. And CBO, to their credit, basically a couple weeks ago got up and said, hey, we screwed up. We were telling you we're going to borrow $1.6 trillion, $1 trillion, maybe $800 billion on the outlier. But it turns out tax receipts came in $477 billion lower is what we're projecting. And it turns out that outlays, mostly healthcare costs, outlays are up 9%, $564 billion. Add that together, that's another $1.041 trillion on top of the projection we were given as we entered this new fiscal year. How many members have you heard come behind these microphones and even tell you the truth or where the math is at? Because we don't want to talk about it. It terrifies us. It's hard to get in front of your audience that, you go back home to your district and say, hey guys, you remember that whole budget thing? Remember when I used to get up in front of you and say we can cut this? Or if you're a Democrat, we're going to raise these taxes over here and everything will be fine. None of that's true. I have come behind this microphone over and over and over, soaked myself in kerosene, played with matches, and told the truth. And you go home, and I'm blessed. I have one of the best educated districts in America. My folks get it. But I get up in front of other audiences, and you almost get booed. Because telling the truth is painful. I had a conversation about 2 hours ago walking through the tunnel here with a member of Congress who's smart. Does more military stuff, but smart. And he made it very clear how upset he is when he sees what I'm doing, because he has to go home and explain it. But you add in the $1 trillion miss from CBO, and we may be about to borrow almost 10% of the entire economy this year. We're already running about 9.6 of our entire GDP right now is our borrowing this year. So I'm going to walk through a number of boards, but first let me nail down how bad the borrowing numbers are. Then what we're going to do is we're going to actually talk about the GDP numbers that came out last week, which were good. And then why we should be terrified that in a time when you actually may have long-run GDP at this and your borrowing's up here, something is horribly wrong. Dear God, what happens if we actually hit a slowdown? What does that gap become? Do we actually have the capacity to keep borrowing at this rate? And will we have anyone here willing to tell the truth about the math? Or does this continue to be a math-free zone because it's inconvenient? So once again, my latest math and our economists, because I'm blessed, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to be the senior Republican over the Joint Economic Committee, so I have the economists, and we've been remarkably accurate the last couple of years. For those of you who've signed up for the daily debt text message, thank you. For those of you who get it and don't like it, screw you. Math is math, the truth is the truth. But it looks like we're going to head to 2.8 to 3 trillion this year at our current burn rate. Remember, the entire economy is about $27.5 trillion. If we hit $3 trillion in borrowing, that's more than 10% of the entire economy is in borrowed money in a single year. Is anyone else terrified? And this one's important, and forgive me if I hit you with the board. It's always dangerous sitting behind me when I'm doing this. When we all go home to our town halls or we're at our Costco talking to people, how many of you understand when that person comes up to you and starts banging on you because they want more spending? Social Security is our number one spend. This year it will be, this fiscal year, it will be about $1.45 trillion. Interest now is over $1 trillion. And the reason you see the little darker blue here is there's a difference between gross interest. Gross interest is when the little sliver that we also pay when we strip the money out of the Social Security Trust Fund, and then we pay them interest, and then every month we have to give them back some of their principal because they don't have enough employment tax revenues to cover the Social Security checks. That's why in 2033 the Social Security Trust Fund is emptied. And our brothers and sisters on Social Security take a 25% cut, and we double senior poverty, which is another thing we're not allowed to talk about here because they'll run nasty ads about you saying, you talked about Social Security. Those that don't talk about it aren't trying to save it. And then number 3 is Medicare. Number 4 is defense. That's where we are budget-wise this fiscal year. Defense is not number 1, not number 2, not number 3. It's 4. Interest is now number 2. Little different than the folklore that when we go home and talk to people at our grocery store, what they think they know. It's our obligation to start telling the truth. So for those of you who do get my daily debt text message, you would have seen this about 2 hours ago. We are now borrowing over $85,000 every second. Every second. And our projection is it's going to continue to go up. And this is even with the little bounce down we had over the last couple months in interest rates. Now we're back over 4.1, or sitting at 4.1 around on the 10. But as you also know, Treasury last month decided to go shorter on the curve. Now they're possibly going to go longer on the curve. We'll get the announcement, I think, Wednesday, what the mix is going to be over the next quarter. Remember, we have to bring about $10 trillion to market this year, this fiscal year. Before we were telling you that $2 trillion was going to be virgin, new issuing to handle the excess spending this year. And the rather 7.9, $8 trillion, well, that was just the refinancing. Now I need to stand in front of you and say there's a chance we're bringing $3 trillion of new issuances at this interest rate, and everything else gets refinanced. It's the death spiral. And we are so close. Maybe this is the time, because I should say it 4 or 5 times. Congress has decided they don't want to be in charge. Let's be honest. You see the clown show we engage in around here, where someone gets their feelings hurt, or someone wants to make up some crap, or we're going to fight over this much on discretionary, yet the fact that if you're borrowing $7.4 billion every single day, and we knife each other for several weeks over $16 billion of savings, you save 2.5 days of borrowing, but we never got around to the big issue, and that's the clown show we've engaged in here. And I know I'm being a jerk, but I'm just so frustrated because I'm terrified this is going to wipe out your retirement and my kids' future. And I have young kids, and they are adorable, and they deserve to prosper. Is borrowing $85,000 a second what you all intended to hand your children? And yet, I'll show in one of these boards here, and I need to say it over and over and over again, Congress has decided we're not in charge. We're not capable. So you want to know who's now in charge? The bond market. The U.S. bond market, the international bond market, is now the one that's going to walk in one day and say, hey, and remember, this actually happened in the 1990s. During the Clinton administration, there was a period there where they basically said, nah, we're going to go on a bond purchase holiday. Interest rates spiked up. White House absolutely freaked out. Congress actually stepped up and did something. And guess what? By the end of the decade, we had substantially a balanced budget. But it took the bond market to kick this Congress in the head. It took a bond market to kick the White House in the head. The numbers are dramatically uglier today than they were in the 1990s. I'm just waiting for the moment when the bond vigilantes say, hey, now's a great time. Let's throw the trigger. Let's go make some money off U.S. sovereign debt. Let's kick every U.S. taxpayer in the head because that Congress isn't willing to step up and do what's hard. But there are things we can do. The problem is every day we wait, we're another $7.3 or $7.4 billion in debt. And every day we wait, the window gets narrower. And the left's basically, their make-believe world is, well, we'll just tax rich people. Well, I'm going to show you that's a complete fantasy. And I've done that for the last 3 times I've come from behind these microphones. So what's our point? Every 140 days, we're borrowing $1 trillion. Got that one. Number 2, if we don't do it, the bond market will do it for us. But when they do, it's ugly. And for every member here, if that happens, you have the obligation to go home and explain why you didn't step up and try to do something. And number 3, I'm going to show you that the fantasy of the left, well, we're just going to tax rich people, gets you 1.5 points. In a fantasy world, maybe 2% of the economy. For those of us on the right, everything we are able to cut, we might get 1 point. Maybe we get 2 points. But if we're borrowing almost 10% of the economy this year, does anyone see a math problem? $2023, which was supposed to be a rough year borrowing-wise. We were supposed to start flattening things out because in 2023, last year, we still had a bunch of the Democrats crazy spending on everything from their Inflation Reduction Act, which is completely Orwellian name. Proves you can just name anything around here, and it doesn't have to actually do with what the legislation does. Some of the other fiscal stimulus, some of their infrastructure spending, chips, all the things we were handing money out. 2023 was supposed to be the rough fiscal year. And in the first 3 months in 2023, last fiscal year, we borrowed $490 billion. First 3 months of this fiscal year, we've borrowed $834 billion. Anyone see a math problem there? So, what does that mean to you and I and the sovereignty and the stability of your country? National debt expected to hit $35 trillion during April. Remember? Last month, well, earlier this month, we had 34. 140 days, we hit 35 trillion. Oh, it gets so much better. That actually means if we've hit 35 billion in April, first week of May, that means in September, just about the time we've ended this fiscal year, we could be crossing 36 trillion. Can't wait to be going into the election cycle in November saying, hey, in just this year, we clipped through 34, 35, now we're at 36. Hey, great job, gang. And the hardest part is to stand in front of that audience back home and say, every dime of today through the next 30 years of borrowing, CBO, Congressional Budget Office, calculates interest, health care, mostly Medicare, and then in 2033, so what is that? 8 budget years, 9 years from now, that first year, the shortfall, when the trust fund is gone in Social Security, that first year, $616 billion shortfall. And the next year it's bigger, and the next year it's bigger, and the next year it's bigger. And that's in the 10-year window. That's in the 9-year, that may be in the 8-year window. But we're going to not talk about it because they'll run nasty ads about us because we talked about something that we need to save. And the immorality, the absolute immorality about this place. We're going to double the poverty of senior Americans in this country in 9 years. And the Democrats say, well, just raise the FICA tax. I'll be here next week or the week after that. We are killing ourselves to get the incredibly accurate numbers. Raising the cap on those $400,000 and up doesn't get you anywhere close to it. Our best estimate is it only covers about 20% of the shortfall. You're still doubling senior poverty at that moment. And if you tax your way to fix it, you've consumed every dollar of available tax. You almost have now tax maximized everything. Functionally meaning, what are you going to do with the other 2/3, 3/4 of the growth of the debt, which is mostly healthcare? I've come behind this microphone dozens of times showing the revolution we could have in healthcare costs. The revolution we could have by adopting technology, changing the way we do things, crash the costs of the debt, crash the costs of the government, grow the economy, family formation, healthcare, everything else gets better. And then you get screamed at walking down the hallways here because that's going to screw up my business model. Or this agency, you'll shut down our agency. Why do you want to put us out of business? Because I'm trying to save the country. Now, it's just at some point it's exhausting dealing with the bedwetting around here. You're going to have to work with me a little bit on this. We tried to do the GDP growth number that came out earlier, actually I think it was into last week. Terrific number in many ways. But we took it for the last year. And then we also annualized the debt so it also matched the same dates. So, so that fancy word, ceteris paribus, whatever that word is, basically saying same time frame, same dates. So if you actually had GDP growth from that fourth quarter 22 to fourth quarter 23, the whole economy, every bit of the economy grew about $1.5 trillion. That's actually much better growth than the economists said we were going to have. Problem is, we borrowed $2.6 trillion during that same time. So the borrowing actually may have been what was driving much of the GDP growth. We did it with debt. And here's just a basic thought experiment. if you're able to tax, now our traditional tax, we get about 17% of the economy. You know, if you lived in a fantasy world, it makes the math much easier. Say 20% of the economy. If I grow $1 trillion of GDP growth, that's $200 billion in tax receipts. Anyone see my math problem? So if I needed to cover $2.6 trillion of borrowing, you need a GDP growth dramatically bigger than this. Remember, $1 trillion of GDP growth, this is just rough numbers off the top of my head, gets you about $200 billion. I need almost 10.5 times that just to produce enough new tax receipts to cover the debt. Because once again, the debt is demographics. We got older and we don't like to talk about it. Are we going to magically change the demographics? But we know what's ahead of us. So, look, another way to look at this. Increase in national debt outpaced growth in the economy by more than $1 trillion over the past year. Fine. Pretty much the same thing I was just showing you. So debt, and this is actually normalizing it for the time gap. So you had about $1.5 trillion of GDP growth. That's terrific. Still borrowed about 2.5, 2.6. Breakdown. Just want to make sure, because some people get upset. So the chart I just showed you was actually borrowing to the public. This over here is total borrowing, gross borrowing. Publicly held, what's the difference between gross and net sort of borrowing? One is where we also borrow out of the trust fund. So over here's the Transportation Trust Fund, over here's Social Security, over here's Medicare. Understand, that cash just doesn't sit there. We borrow, we do pay interest. And then we got to pay it back. And remember, once again, because I've given this as a presentation a dozen times, Social Security Trust Fund, gone 2023. Medicare Trust Fund, gone 7 years. Transportation Trust Fund, gone, what, 5 years? And then there's a dozen other smaller trust funds that are all gone in that time. Do we have any understanding the level of recapitalization we have to gauge in the next 9 years? But I'm sure glad that today we're back here in Congress, and behind all these microphones, we're going to spend some time talking about how the economic survival of this country is our most important. It's not like it's our job. And here's one of the intense ironies. Tax receipts, first 3 months, tax receipts are up 8%. Being on Ways and Means, being the senior Republican over the Joint Economic Committee, this number's terrific. 8% growth in our tax receipts. That is absolutely terrific. Oh, but gross interest is up 37%. Outlays are up 11.8%. The deficit grew 21%. Anyone see a math problem? Just if you would actually hold the deficit growth to the tax receipt growth. But the problem is we don't control the interest. And we don't control our brothers and sisters turning 65 and moving into their earned benefits. We've known the numbers. We knew baby boomers were around for what, 65 years? It was just uncomfortable to talk about the actual math. So let's actually go into a little bit more of the fun stuff here. So why are so many Americans cranky? I believe this chart shows it. You take a look at economic growth. So the numbers of '90s, 2000s, 2009 to 2017, under President Trump. Look at these. Under President Trump, you had a 9.8% growth in your income. So far, when you adjust for inflation, the growth in your income, you're negative today. You are poorer today than you were 30 months ago. I actually try to explain, some people talk about, well, there's this MAGA thing out there, and then there's these populists, and these people are really upset. It's because they're poorer today. Working class Americans, this is our working class brothers and sisters out there. They're working their hearts out just to try to survive. They are poorer today. In my community, the Phoenix Scottsdale area, unless your wages are up about 20 to 22% over the last 30-some months, you are poorer today than you were 30, 32, 33 months ago. No wonder you're cranky. You may not completely understand the math of inflation and everything's more expensive and how are you going to finance your next car and have you seen your mortgage rates? But this chart shows it. And for my brothers and sisters on the left, have some love, have some compassion. Understand people are getting crushed. Stop making excuses. All right, this one falling apart. And I was just going to try to make the point, because we're now going to walk into some of the tax economics. I've used this chart a number of times. We were basically looking, the point here, if we can confiscate it, every dime of people that make $500,000 and up. So you make $501, that $1 is government's. We just confiscate everything. We get about $1.5 trillion. And before, when we were doing this chart for 2024, we were walking around saying, and we're going to borrow 1.7. Does anyone get the joke here? It's now 6-7 weeks later since we produced this chart, and it's no longer 1.7 we're going to borrow. Now it's almost $3 trillion at the current burn rate. But we can confiscate every dime of people $500,000 and up, and you get about 1.7 trillion. And I need to invest in more tape. Thanks. And one more time, I've done versions of this. And the real punchline here is, as you show, if we, all untaxed persons and small businesses, adjusted gross income, AGI, annualized earnings above the listed income threshold. All right, what are we saying? If we took every dime of $500,000 and up, I get about 5.3% of the economy. We're going to borrow over 10. Or it looks like we're heading towards borrowing 10% of the entire economy. Now, obviously, if you started confiscating every dime, you crash the economy. It's just basically to try to demonstrate the absurdity of the math that seems to come from my brothers and sisters on the left. So let's walk through, and I'm going to do this one again. Now, I'm not going to make you suffer through that one. Go on to Manhattan Institute, Brian Riedel, go back about 4 or 5 months. He basically gathered up, and I've done the whole study as a floor speech here. He gathered up all the sort of studies that say, what's the tax maximization rate? What happens if you took people over 400,000, over 500,000, and maximize their income taxes, maximize their estate taxes, maximize their capital gains taxes, maximize their corporate taxes? He did it all. And there's this concept of tax maximization. You got to understand, if I tax you at 100%, how much tax do I get from you? 0, because you're not going to work. Well, if I tax you at 0, I get 0, because you're going to work a lot, but you get to keep everything. There's this concept here, and the best models start to say, hey, once you start to get around 62% on income tax, you actually roll over, and you actually start getting less. And people say, well, back in the 60s and 50s, but understand also the number of deductions you actually had in that time. No one actually paid those rates because you got to deduct this, got to deduct your meals, got to deduct your interest, got to deduct your credit cards. So you got to do that, line them up. So Brian at Manhattan Institute basically took all those taxes and said, I'm putting everything at its maximum tax rate for these high-income earners. And then he adjusted it for the economic effects and basically came back and said, hey, you're going to get 1.1 to 2% of the economy in new taxes. Remember, that's the Democrats' plan, is we're going to tax rich people, we're going to maximize all their taxes. Let's say you get the 2%. How many times have I already mentioned we may be heading to, because right now we're burning what, about 7.5? No, actually, no, right now we're burning almost 9% of, if you do total gross borrowing of the economy. We may hit up as high as 10. CBO before was projecting we'd be at like 7.5%. But anyone see a math problem? If the tax nirvana of the left gets you at most 2%, more likely 1.5%, and you're borrowing 10, does anyone see a math problem? But yet, we have so many people who don't want to hear this. You know, the 12 people who are probably watching this, if you're on the Democrat side, you've already turned off your television. If you're that reporter that stuck the mic in my face, you didn't want to hear this because this doesn't reaffirm your sarcasm. For my brothers and sisters on the right, I can find you 1-2% of the economy we can cut. You know, and there's really brutal cuts I would support because we don't have a choice. We have to deal with the morality right now. We borrow money to send it to city, state, others who actually have their own taxing authority. And they're programs I love. Should we do that? Everything's borrowed. So, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, may I ask how much time I have?
The gentleman has 23 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I promise I'm only going to use a few more moments. There's some things I'm optimistic about. And I promise sometime in the next couple of weeks I'll get here and I'll actually make some charts. It's just in the last 30 days the numbers have moved against us. The CBO has admitted they missed the numbers by over $1 trillion. And I'm just angry I hear no one talk about it. So one of the presentations I did almost a year ago was talking about a market way to take on drug costs. Now understand, I'll bring the charts in the next week or so. The actual drug costs as our total healthcare costs are actually pretty darn small. And then you have a substitution effect of how many procedures, medical surgeries, other things no longer need to happen, you know, how many people actually get healthier. But what I was trying to sell was a theory. The Democrats want to do a rationing price control model. Functionally, it's in Europe. Let me see if I can try to explain this. In Europe, you actually have something, a formula. It says, if a certain drug doesn't create an additional quality life year, and it costs more than a certain dollar amount, you don't get it. So there's some countries, it's been a couple years since I did this. Great Britain had one where I think if the drug was more than like $13,000 a year, but didn't create an additional quality life year, they just didn't buy it. It's a type of rationing. It's sort of a cost cap on functionally your life. And that's what the Democrats' H.R. 3 from a couple of years ago did. It actually created a rationing with a cap. And that's what they actually did in, I believe, their Inflation Reduction Act. They're very proud they're going to start negotiating prices on 10 drugs. Fine. Doesn't do much. Look at the actual economic effect. It doesn't really do much. So let's actually think about some of the crazy things that have started to happen in the pharmaceutical marketplace over the last few months and what we could do policy-wise to keep this disruption moving faster and faster and faster to disrupt the price of drugs. Bit of trivia. are generic drugs, off-patent drugs in America, more expensive or less expensive than the rest of the world? They're about 16% less expensive in the United States than they are in Europe. Those are the off-patent. So it's the patent ones we get our heads kicked in. So, but how do you take the entire drug ecosystem and change it? And think of some of the things that are going on around us. You just had one of the large PBMs say, benefit purchasing managers, say, okay, we're changing our model. It's no longer this formulary. We're just going to buy drugs at the best negotiated price, and we're just going to do this sliver of markup, and we're just going to sell them at that. So the complaint that they were playing games and some drugs they were making really expensive, some they were selling cheap, that's over. Now you actually had one of the major manufacturers say, screw it. We're going around the system. We're selling directly to our customers. The manufacturer's now going to sell directly to the customers. Okay. Then you have others like, which I'm fascinated with, companies like Civica, which actually isn't a company, it's a co-op. And as a co-op, everything from a state Medicare system or Medicaid system to an insurance company to hospitals to this and that. And they're taking generic drugs and they're just making them themselves. And this is one of my arguments about insulin prices. They're making 8 versions of insulin, generic insulins, and they're selling it, they intend to sell it for less than the Democrats' subsidized price. So the Democrats come behind these microphones and say, we hate Big Pharma. And then their plan is they turn around and say, let's give $16 billion to Big Pharma, we'll buy down the price of insulin, we'll tell people we actually did something, yet a co-op is going to do the same thing without government money and do it for less. Does anyone see a problem here? And then by them doing the $16 billion of handing that money to Big Pharma, they actually make the concept of putting together co-ops to actually make generic drugs more difficult. It's just, once again, the insanity. One of the weight loss drugs, one of the molecules that, you know, it's not semaglutide, it's the first molecule that was patent. That one came off patent January 1st. I think I'm allowed to say, because we've been actually having lots of conversations with some of the generic drug manufacturers. Expect in May to see one of these diet drugs that block, that actually produce the hormone, do those things. They'll be generic in May. And we know some of those have been just stunning miracles. There's some great studies out there that actually its effectiveness may change the U.S. economy. Let's see, what else is also going on? You just saw Florida got the right to re-import from Canada. My understanding, Colorado, I think there's a couple Indian tribes which are making applications to the FDA to re-import. Some of the economists say, oh, that's not going to make much of a difference. It's not about it making a difference. It's the concept that for many of us who love markets, you may see it as chaos. I actually see it as a market battling each other to bring things to the public faster, better, cheaper, provide optionality, different silos where you can purchase. And through that, we increase your choice, your optionality, and we maximize price efficiency. And you actually see these incredible things happening. And now there's a whole new world we're going to have to figure out is if that's happening on this side of the ledger, and then what did you also see? I think it was in December, we had the first genetic drug that cures come out of the FDA. Sickle cell anemia. They change the genetics, and it's now approved. It's out the door. It's really expensive. But why it's a miracle is now we know how to do it. We actually know how to do an actual genetic drug. One of the most powerful things we can do for this society is no longer engaging what the left so often does is ration, subsidize, and maintain your misery. There's a group of us here who believe cures are the greatest morality and also the best economics. There is hope. Mr. Speaker, there is hope. But until we actually start to tell the truth about how fast the debt is moving against us, the window's closing on us fast. And for many of our Democrat colleagues, the con used to be, we'll stall, the Republicans will get squeezed and they'll have to agree that just tax hikes, because that will be the only option that's left. Problem is, the debt is so huge, or to quote my 8-year-old, so ginormous, that the tax option only closes a small portion. The solution is in policy. I desperately had hoped we would be up and working on things like the Debt and Deficit Commission, because for those who are freaked out, they might raise taxes, they might cut programs, they might do everything. But the vast majority of saving this country from the death spiral of its debt is actually in policy. The problem is, when you do policy, you take on a whole lot of business models, bureaucracies, the way you force people to compete differently. And this place is often a protection racket. It's a protection racket of this business model, of this bureaucracy. And yet that disruption is, the morality is in the disruption. It's also our path we save ourselves. And if we wait much longer, it doesn't matter. The bond market will be the one that actually runs this place, runs this government, because we will have basically walked away from our chance to be the influencers. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.